For regular videos on ancient cultures and forgotten civilizations, please subscribe.
For a century or more, the idea of the lost continent of Mu has captivated the imaginations of enthusiasts of ancient mysteries. Allegedly submerged by a cataclysmic event, in a similar way to legendary continents like Atlantis and Lemuria, and sometimes equated with Atlantis, Mu has remained somewhat on the sidelines, but people still talk about it, and I think the foundation of this myth and the evidence supporting its reality are worth exploring. So today, we're going to take a look at the book that made the idea famous. Lost Continent of Mu, Motherland of Man. What is the evidence for the existence of this lost continent? Will it stand up to scrutiny, or will it sink into the ocean like a lost continent? Welcome to the Myths of Ancient History series, in which we look at fantastical claims about the ancient past, and I explain the reasons why the world's historians are not convinced by them. In the process, we can go over a bit about how historical research works. The concept of Mu dates back to the 1800s, but gained widespread popularity through James Churchward, a British-American writer, inventor, and engineer. His book, Lost Continent of Mu, The Motherland of Man, published 1926, was a success, leading to subsequent works, The Children of Mu, 1931, and The Sacred Symbols of Mu, 1933. Churchward described Mu as a vast, fertile continent in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, with lush plains and majestic mountain ranges. These geographical features, he argued, reflected the wealth and prosperity of this legendary civilization. The inhabitants of Mu were said to be technologically, socially, and culturally advanced, excelling in architecture, engineering, mathematics, and astronomy, far surpassing other civilizations of their time. According to Churchward, the Nal people thrived on Mu from 50,000 to 12,000 years ago. At its peak, Mu reportedly housed many large cities and colonies on other continents, with a population of 64 million people. Churchward claimed that after Mu's destruction, its survivors spread across the world, bringing their expertise to places like Egypt, China, and the Americas, where they helped establish great civilizations. Architectural remnants and symbols left behind by Mu's survivors are said to bear witness to their enduring legacy. You can see some similarities here with the Atlantis concept. I suppose I should start with a few words about the scientific possibility of a lost continent in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. A continent, as you probably know, is one of Earth's major land masses, which includes both dry land and continental shelves. Generally, continents are characterized by high elevation compared to areas with oceanic crust, a diverse range of siliceous, igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary rocks, thicker crust with lower seismic velocity than oceanic crust, and distinct boundaries around a sufficiently large area to be considered a continent, rather than a microcontinent or fragment. According to plate tectonics, the dominant geological theory that explains the formation of the major landforms, Earth's crust is made up of lighter sile rocks, continental crust rich in aluminum silicates, that float on denser sima rocks, oceanic crust rich in magnesium silicates. The ocean floor lacks sile and has a thinner crust, while continents are massive solid blocks that are much thicker. Since continents float on sima, like icebergs on water, they cannot sink beneath the ocean. Continental drift and seafloor spreading can alter the shape and position of continents, and occasionally split a continent into pieces, as with Pangea, but these processes are very slow, occurring over hundreds of millions of years. So, for example, advances in plate tectonic simulation have led to the discovery of lost continents like Greater Adria in 2019. Greater Adria separated from the southern supercontinent Gondwana about 240 million years ago and moved northward. Around 140 million years ago, it was a landmass the size of Greenland, largely submerged, where sediments accumulated and turned into rock. As it collided with what is now Europe 100 to 120 million years ago, it broke apart, with only fragments of its rocks remaining on the surface for geologists to find. A straight-up submerged continent has been found, too. Zealandia is another mostly submerged continental crust in Oceania that sank after separating from Gondwana 83 to 79 million years ago. A 2021 study suggests Zealandia is over 1 billion years old, much older than previously thought. It is identifiable because it is substantially elevated above the ocean crust. Today, it is about 94% submerged, and it began to submerge around 23 million years ago, when its thinned crust was affected by thermal relaxation, and the Southeast expansion movement separated Zealandia from the Antarctic about 10 million years ago. Over the last 5 million years, Zealandia has been generally subsiding because the Pacific Plate has been subducting westward and retreating eastward. So this was a gradual process occurring over millions of years. But a mere 1,000 years or even tens of thousands of years is not long enough for this process to happen. The cyma beneath the continental crust is effectively solid, anchoring the continents in place. Thus, the positions and shapes of continents and ocean floors have remained stable throughout the time humans have been on the Earth. There is no plausible event that could have destroyed a continent quickly, as its vast mass of sile rocks would have to end up somewhere, and there's no evidence of such a landmass at the bottom of the oceans. There are no traces of a lost continent like Mu at the bottom of the Pacific. But this is a history channel, and Churchward's pieces of evidence for the lost continent of Mu are chiefly historical in nature. So let's examine the ones he gives in his first book. I've already gone through it and fact-checked it. Churchward makes it difficult to follow his paper trail because the book contains very few citations, and the ones that he does have are vague. But I did my best to track things down for you. Are his supports strong enough to make us question the scientific evidence I just shared with you? Let's see. We'll start with the Maya evidence. The Madrid Codex. The first historical documentation of Mu that Churchward provides is from the Madrid manuscript, a document produced by the Maya. He obtained this piece of evidence from an earlier work by Augustus Le Plongeon called Queen Mu and the Egyptian Sphinx. For a little background, Le Plongeon was an antiquarian and a photographer who was very interested in the Maya, and who spent a large portion of his life trying to prove that the Maya were connected with Atlantis, and that they were the source of ancient Egyptian culture. He lived in the 1800s, but even then, his ideas that the Maya culture was the cradle of world civilization were considered bunk by Maya archaeologists. In those days, the Madrid Codex was still in two separate pieces, which were called the Troano manuscript and the Codex Cortesianus, which they did not know belonged together. Le Plongeon wrote, "The author of the Troano manuscript tells us that anciently the peninsula was called Mayax, that is, the primitive land, the terra firma." He's talking about the Yucatan Peninsula. He gave its name to the whole empire of the Mayas that comprised all the countries known today as Central America, from the Isthmus of Darien on the south to that of Tehuantepec on the north. The site of the government was at Uxmal, but the great emporium of their arts and sciences, the heart, consequently, of that marvelous civilization, was at Chichen Itza. That became a vast metropolis. In its temples, pilgrims from all parts came to worship, and even offer their own persons as a sacrifice to the Almighty, by throwing themselves into the sacred well from which the city took its name. There also came the wise men from afar to consult the Hmenes, learned priest whose college still exists. Among these foreigners were bearded men whose features vividly recall those of the Assyrians of old and the Afghans of today. From Chichen, this great civilization seems to have extended its influence to the remotest parts of the earth, and to have exercised its controlling power among far distant and heterogeneous nations. The fact is that we meet with the name Maya in many countries of Asia, Africa, Europe, as well as of America, and always with the meaning of wisdom and power attached to it. We now know today that the material evidence from the Yucatan shows that the Maya never had a unified empire, and that Chichen Itza was one of the later cities built by the Maya. If you want to know more about the history of Chichen Itza, you can see my video on it, which I will link below. Today, we also know that the Codex was written sometime between 900 and 1521 of our own era. but Le Plongeon believed it was thousands of years old. Anyway, in his book Queen Mu and the Egyptian Sphinx, published in 1896, Le Plongeon presents a story about a woman he believed was a historical Maya queen whose life was documented in the carved bas-reliefs, statues, and murals he found at Chichen Itza. He thought that the Egyptian myth of Isis and Osiris was based on Queen Mu and her husband, Prince Ko. The book is very imaginative, and his interpretations of the art at Chichen Itza have never been accepted by any Maya experts, then or since. Le Plongeon also claimed to have been able to read Maya hieroglyphs, and in his book he provides translations of parts of the Madrid Codex. Churchward uses Le Plongeon's translations in his book. Now, here's the interesting part. Le Plongeon not only spoke of a queen named Mu, but also of a lost continent called Mu, which he connected with Atlantis. One section of the Codex, Le Plongeon translates as follows. The year 6 Khan, on the 11th Muluk, in the month Zak, there occurred terrible earthquakes, which continued without intermission until the 13th Chuan. The country of the hills of mud, the land of Mu, was sacrificed. Being twice upheaved, it suddenly disappeared during the night, the basin being continually shaken by volcanic forces. Being confined, these caused the land to sink and rise several times and in various places. At last the surface gave way, and the 10 countries were torn asunder and scattered in fragments, unable to withstand the force of the seismic convulsions. They sank, with their 64 million of inhabitants, 8,060 years before the writing of this book. And here's a translation he shared from the other section of the Codex. By his strong will, Homan caused the earth to tremble after sunset, and during the night, Mu, the country of the hills of mud, was submerged. Mu, the life of the basin, was submerged by Homan during the night. The place of the dead ruler is now lifeless. It moves no more after having twice jumped from its foundations. The king of the deep, while forcing his way out, has shaken it up and down, has killed it, has submerged it. Twice Mu jumped from its foundations. It was then sacrificed with fire. It burst while being shaken up and down violently by the earthquake. By kicking it, the wizard that makes all things move like a mass of worms sacrificed it that very night. Now, you might be thinking, wait, I thought Maya hieroglyphs were not deciphered in the 1800s. And you would be right. In fact, they're still working out Maya hieroglyphs, though we know a great deal more now than we did then, which was almost nothing. Yeah, Le Plongeon was using a system devised by a priest named Delanda with a bit of his own interpretations thrown in. Since he believed that there was a link between Egyptian and Maya civilization, he used Egyptian glyphs to interpret Maya glyphs. Today, we now know that the Madrid Codex is an almanac containing astronomical charts and horoscopes. Le Plongeon's translations are incorrect, and in fact, never were accepted. But Churchward placed a lot of stock in them. If you want to know more about how Maya hieroglyphs were deciphered, I have a video on that too, which I will link below. So basically, this is a case of someone claiming to be able to read Maya writing and not. But it illustrates one method that fantastic history promoters will use. They'll present inscriptions that support their ideas, but it just so happens the translations of these inscriptions are of their own invention. The Uxmal Temple inscription. In his book on the sacred mysteries of the Maya and the Quiches, Le Plongeon refers to the Avadino at Uxmal, sometimes called the Pyramid of the Magician or Pyramid of the Dwarf, which he names the Temple of Sacred Mysteries. But Churchward claims that there's an inscription on the walls of the structure that reads, "This edifice is a commemorative monument dedicated to the memory of Mu, the lands of the West, that land of Kui, the birthplace of our sacred mysteries." I looked everywhere for reference to the inscription in the writings of Le Plongeon and couldn't find it. Then I widened out and looked for reference to this inscription anywhere else. Nothing. Then I looked for reference to any inscription on this pyramid whatsoever, and I came up blank. Where did Churchward get this from? I have no idea. Here's what Churchward says about it. The inscription quoted is a full corroboration of the second extract from the Troano manuscript, and confirms other records which state that the motherland lay to the west of America. Further, and this is most important, it tells us that the religious teachings of this temple came from there, so that whatever we find here, we know originated in Mu, the lands of the West. With this information, we can trace the Egyptian religion and learning back to its source. But this corroboration of the Troano manuscript, the Madrid Codex, itself appears to have no corroboration. All I can tell you is that the pyramid is a little more than 1,000 years old, and that Le Plongeon interpreted its ornaments as if it were writing. Here's what he writes. The ornaments that cover these walls are remarkable in more than one sense. They are not only inscriptions in the Maya language, written in characters identical with and having the same meaning and value as those carved on the temples of Egypt, but among them are symbols known to have belonged to the ancient sacred mysteries of the Egyptians, and to modern Freemasonry. But he didn't provide a translation. If this is where Churchward's inscription comes from, then we're not looking at actual writing. We're looking at art. This approach, interpreting art as writing, is another strategy fantastic history purveyors will sometimes use. And of course, the interpretation of the symbols is entirely of their own making. The Xochicalco pyramid inscription. In her book, Queen Mu's Talisman, Alice Le Plongeon, his wife, wrote, Dr. Le Plongeon has discovered in translating the inscriptions, written in Maya language with Egyptian and Maya characters, which adorn the faces of the Pyramid of Xochicalco, situated 60 miles to the southwest of the city of Mexico, in the state of Morelos, 18 miles from the city of Cuernavaca. That said pyramid was a commemorative monument raised to perpetuate the memory of the destruction of the land of Mu among coming generations, and that it was made an exact model of the sacred hill in Atlantis, which Plato in his Timaeus describes as having been crowned by a temple dedicated to Cleito and Poseidon. She appears to be talking about the Temple of the Feathered Serpent at Xochicalco, where stylized reliefs can be found on the side of it. Churchward's version is this. There is an inscription on it, which Le Plongeon has translated as follows. This pyramid is a commemorative monument raised to perpetuate the destruction of the lands of the West among coming generations. But this is another example of where art is being interpreted as writing. There is, of course, nothing Egyptian here. That temple was built between 700 and 900 CE. The AKAB inscription. Churchward claims that at Chichen Itza there is a building called the AKAB, which has an inscription describing the destruction of the lands of the West by a cataclysm. This he also gets from Le Plongeon, who has a sketch of it in his book on Queen Mu. Alas, this is another case of Le Plongeon thinking he knows how to read Maya hieroglyphs, but cannot. I couldn't find his literal translation of it, but I did find more info about the building. There's a lintel in it that provides the date of the inauguration of the building, and in our own calendar, that's June 26, 879, CE. Not very ancient. We also learn from the Casa Colorada text in a nearby structure that the AKAB was the mansion of a man named Yahweh Cho'Ka'ak, who was the head of the administration at Chichen Itza. Okay, that's enough from the imagination of Augustus Le Plongeon. Now that we have covered the Maya evidence, let's look at other evidence Churchward provides from other parts of the world. The Lassa Record. Churchward claims that an inscription was found on a Buddhist temple in Lhasa, Tibet, that reads, When the star Baal fell on the place where is now only sea and sky, the 7 cities with their golden gates and transparent temples quivered and shook like the leaves of a tree in a storm. And behold, a flood of fire and smoke arose from the palaces. Agony and cries of the multitude filled the air. They sought refuge in their temples and citadels. And the wise Mu, the hieratic of Ra-Mu, arose and said to them, Did I not predict all this? And the women and the men in their precious stones and shining garments lamented, Mu, save us! And Mu replied, You shall die together with your slaves and your riches, and from your ashes will arise new nations. If they forget they are superior, not because of what they put on, but of what they put out, the same lot will befall them. Flame and smoke choked the words of Mu. The land and its inhabitants were torn to pieces and swallowed by the depths in a few months. Now here we have reference to Mu, but as a person, not as a place. Where did Churchward get this information? He got it from an article published in the New York American Magazine in October of 1912, titled, "How I Found the Lost Atlantis, the Source of All Civilization." The author identifies himself as Dr. Paul Schliemann, grandson of Heinrich Schliemann. The writer claims that a few days before his death, Heinrich Schliemann left a sealed envelope with a close friend, and on it was written the words, "This can be opened only by a member of my family who solemnly vows to devote his life to the researches outlined therein." He also says that an hour before Schliemann died, he asked for a pencil and paper and wrote with a trembling hand that his owl-headed vase should be broken, and inside are instructions about how to find Atlantis. The writer says that none of the other relatives were interested, and it was only he that dared to open the envelope and the vase. He then says that he found proof of Atlantis and would publish it all in a book. The book was never produced, although over the next few years he published other articles in various newspapers. Then no one ever heard from him again. Anyway, in this first article, he provides numerous pieces of evidence that have never been verified by anyone, and this Lassa inscription is one of them. Paul Schliemann says that the inscription, which apparently he found, is Chaldean and from 2000 BC. Churchward doesn't seem to have accepted the date, though, as he says that the inscription seemed more modern, and he cut off the last 4 words of Schliemann's translation, "in a few months," because Churchward believed the cataclysm happened in a few days, so he shows a willingness here to doctor the evidence as needed. It turns out we have no evidence for the existence of a Paul Schliemann. Some have speculated that maybe the article was written by Agamemnon Schliemann, Heinrich Schliemann's son, who perhaps chose to call himself Paul. But then why would he say he's Heinrich's grandson? But the family tree does not have a Paul in it, so the possibility that all of this is a hoax seems likely. Heinrich Schliemann's closest associates never mentioned that he ever showed an interest in Atlantis. And this article, as others have pointed out, contains a number of unbelievably clumsy errors. It says that a bronze vase found at Troy has Phoenician hieroglyphics on it, but the Phoenicians used an alphabet, not hieroglyphs. It says that Tiwanaku is in Central America, but it's in South America. He talks about the Lion Gate of Mycenae being in Crete. Mycenae is not in Crete. He says that the Troano manuscript is in the British Museum, but it's in Madrid. More pertinent to our discussion, the oldest temples at Lhasa in Tibet are from the 600s of our own era, the period of the Tang dynasty. And the earliest inscriptions found there date from the late 8th to early 9th centuries. So an inscription from 2000 BC on one of them is impossible, as the temples would not have been there. It is possible that an inscription was Chaldean, if the author means members of the Nestorian Christian Church. They did have a community there. But the inscription then would be on one of their monasteries, not on a Buddhist temple. But no record of this particular inscription is anywhere that I could find. Even if it exists, the words I just read you say nothing about a lost continent called Mu. The Nal Tablets. Churchward got the idea of the Nal from Le Plongeon, who referred to the Maya adepts who spread civilization globally as Nal, claiming it meant exalted. Churchward adopted the term Nal in his own works, using it to describe both the people of Mu and their language. Churchward claimed that during a trip to India, he met an Indian priest, one of only 3 in the entire country who could read the lost language of Nal. After convincing the priest of his sincere motives, Churchward was granted access to the Nal Tablets within the secret archive of a temple. With the priest's help, he translated these texts, but Churchward never showed these tablets to anyone. He published his translation in his book. We don't know their author, we don't know their date, their country of origin is unclear. Churchward said either Burma or Mu itself. No Nal tablets have ever been discovered since. They're widely considered to be a complete fabrication. But even if not, they don't actually talk about Mu. Churchward just believed that they were written in the language of Mu, and he used them to try to decipher other symbols and texts in other countries. Plato and Procus. His next evidence comes from a comparison of statements made by the ancient Greeks Plato and Procus. This actually comes from Le Plongeon too. Le Plongeon wrote, Proclus mentions the existence of 10 countries or islands, as Plato did. This is probably where Churchward got the idea. Churchward embellishes it. He says, in Plato's Timaeus Critias, we find this reference to the lost continent. The land of Mu had 10 peoples. Proclus wrote, the lands of the West had 10 peoples. Here we find two of the old Greek philosophers writing about the motherland of man. One uses the hieratical name, while the other uses its geographical name. But both assert that there were 10 separate peoples. When I first read this, I thought to myself, the books of Plato are about Atlantis. I don't remember Plato ever writing about a land called Mu. So I had to double check to make sure I didn't miss something so significant. First I checked the Timaeus, nothing in there about Mu or about 10 peoples. Then I checked the Critias, nothing about Mu. It does say that Atlantis was divided into 10 portions. Maybe he draws the conclusion that the 10 portions were inhabited by 10 peoples. Well, he says Plato used Mu's geographical name, which apparently means Atlantis, so he just assumes they are the same. If Churchward thinks that Atlantis is Mu, fine, but he put the land of Mu in quotes, which makes it seem like a direct translation. Proclus, he says, uses Mu's hieratical name. Hieratical usually is a reference to Egyptian writing, but I think Churchward may be referring to his proposed Nakal writing system. Either way, finding the reference in Proclus is hard because Churchward never provides citations. That's always a red flag. So I dug. Proclus was a Neoplatonist from the 5th century CE, late Roman times, who wrote commentaries on Plato. Churchward seems to be referring to Proclus' commentary on the Timaeus. Proclus does make reference to the 10 kings of Atlantis and says this comes from the Critias, but I couldn't find any time that Proclus said the lands of the West had 10 peoples. I couldn't even find where he used the expression the lands of the West. He does seem to indicate that Atlantis is in the West. Is this all that Churchward means? But if Churchward believes the lost continent is west of America, not merely west of Greece, Proclus doesn't establish the existence of a continent west of America, or that it went by the name of Mu. This appears to be a case of Churchward saying, well, it's not what they wrote, but it's what they meant. The Greek alphabet. This is a good one. Churchward claims that the Greek alphabet is composed of Maya vocables, and that each letter has esoteric meaning, and that you can read the alphabet, and it forms a story, which he calls an epic. Yes, he actually just reads the letters of the alphabet in order, and he provides this translation. Heavily break the waters over the plains. They cover the low places. Where there are obstructions, shores form. The earth is struck with water. The water spread on all that lives and moves. The foundations give way, and submerged is the land of Mu. The peaks only appear above the water. Whirlwinds blow around until gradually comes cold air. Before where existed valleys are great depths, cold tanks. In circular places mud banks formed. A mouth opens out of which vapors pour forth and volcanic sediments. Most notably, the letters lambda and mu together supposedly mean submerged is the land of Mu. All of this is nonsense, of course, but this he also got from Le Plongeon, who saw the Maya's hand in everything and used his interpretation of Maya writing, which we now know to be wrong. When you don't have a real document, you invent one. The Ramayana. Another piece of evidence Churchward provides is from the Indian epic the Ramayana. He quotes two passages. The Mayas were mighty navigators, whose ships traveled from the western to the eastern oceans, and from the southern to the northern seas in ages so remote that the sun had not yet risen above the horizon. That likewise, being learned architects, they built great cities and palaces. In this one he does provide a citation, though it doesn't say which translation of the Ramayana he used, and providing the verse numbers would have been better. But I tracked it down. It turns out he actually got this from Le Plongeon in his Queen Mu book again. Here is what Le Plongeon wrote. Valmiki in his beautiful epic the Ramayana, which is said to have served as a model to Homer's Iliad, tells us that the Mayas were mighty navigators whose ships traveled from the western to the eastern ocean, from the southern to the northern seas, in ages so remote that the sun had not yet risen above the horizon. That being likewise great warriors, they conquered the southern parts of the Hindustani peninsula and established themselves there. That being also learned architects, they built great cities and palaces. And Plongeon cites Hippolyte Fauchet's French translation of the Ramayana, Volume 1, page 353, published in 1864. So I looked it up. And here is an English translation of the French. "Begin by listening," replied Sugriva, "to what is the courage, the energy, the vigor, the firmness of Bali, and then decide what is expedient. Before the sun is risen, Bali, already shaking off the torpor of sleep, goes from the western sea to the eastern ocean, and from the southern ocean to the northern sea. In his extreme vigor he seizes the summits and the great peaks of the mountains, throws them into the heavens quickly, and recaps them in his hand. Think then to kill him with a single arrow shot. Otherwise we shall have kindled the anger of Bali, and we ourselves shall undergo kakutside, or that death which we intend for him." So clearly here, Sugriva, the banished king of Kishkinda, is talking about Bali, sometimes called Vali, his brother, who holds the throne. Maybe Le Plongeon interpreted the kingdom of Kishkinda to be the Maya Empire, but this is an Indian kingdom, not an American one. The second quote about building great cities and palaces comes from page 26 of Fauchet's translation, and Le Plongeon translates it into English as follows. "In olden times there was a prince of the Danavas, a learned magician endowed with great power. His name was Maya. It was he who by magic art constructed this golden grotto. He was the Vishvakarma, architect of the gods, of the principal Danavas, and this superb palace of solid gold is the work of his hands." I guess he was excited that he found a character in the Ramayana with the name Maya. Does it have anything to do with the Maya civilization of America? Of course not. It is interesting that Churchward quotes Le Plongeon's interpretation as if it is coming directly from the Ramayana. Churchward is coming across as a bit lazy here, not checking the references for himself. Whatever the case, there is no mention of Mu or a lost continent. The Anor Tom Lions. Another piece of evidence he provides comes from the Bayon Temple at Anor Tom in Cambodia. The temple was built in the late 12th or early 13th century by King Jayavarman VII. This is medieval times, but somehow he thinks special ancient knowledge was preserved here. Specifically, he refers to the lion sculptures on the temple. He writes, "All are placed facing the east, looking toward the place where the motherland once stood. That these beasts refer to her there can be no question, as they are saying moo." I'm not joking. The lions are looking east and saying moo. A feature common to early and late ancient temples is the beautiful lion statues, acting not only as guardians to the shrines, but also emblematic of ancient royalty and divinity. On the early pyramid temples, they flank the staircase leading to the top of the shrine. At early brick temples, flanking the entrance to the main shrine, and at later temples, flanking the terraces, often alongside Naga balustrades. They do not always face east. Churchward's justification for this interpretation is, this is shown by their conventional mouths, elongated squares, one of the forms of the letter M in the hieratic alphabet of Mu, and one of her symbols. Apparently, the roaring lion's mouth in Cambodia is representing a glyph from an invented Muan alphabet. Another case of creating an elaborate theory and then using its own parts to prove that it's true. The Easter Island legend. Churchward speaks of a legend on Easter Island apparently told by the inhabitants as follows. "This little island had once been a part of a great continent of land, crossed with many roads, beautifully paved with flat stones." I couldn't find the source for this information. He speaks of the Nal Tablets and the translations provided by a William Thompson, who said he bribed one of the natives of the island into translating for him. But this legend is not on any of the tablets or related at all in Thompson's book that I could find. Whatever the case, geological study has shown that the islands in the Pacific Ocean are not parts of a submerged continent, but are instead isolated volcanoes. Specifically, Easter Island is a relatively recent volcanic peak encircled by deep ocean, reaching depths of 3,000 meters, just 30 kilometers from the island. And the concentration of Moai platforms along the island's current coast suggests that the shape of Easter Island has remained largely unchanged since these structures were constructed. When having to choose between the testimony of a story that someone tells you and the findings of science, it is wiser to give more weight to the scientific evidence. The Egyptian Book of the Dead. Churchward claims that the Egyptian Book of the Dead is not a collection of funerary texts filled with spells to assist a dead person through the afterlife, as Egyptologists say, but rather a sacred commemorative memorial dedicated to the multitudes of people who lost their lives at the destruction of Mu, the forefathers of the Egyptians and all mankind. He says the expression per meru in the title, which is usually translated coming forth by day, actually means Mu has gone forth from the day. The letter M, he says, which Egyptologists consider a preposition, is nothing of the kind. Rather, it is a symbol for the name Mu. He says he has found the true esoteric meaning of the hieroglyphs, getting assistance from Indian writings, since he believes that the Indians taught the Egyptians their sacred religion. So he makes his own translations and comes up with phrases like, "The Egyptians came from Mu, a land which is dead and exists no more." He says that's in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The whole idea of discarding knowledge about the Egyptian language and assuming that the literal meaning of the words is irrelevant, but that there's a secret language embedded in the glyphs and symbols, is almost entirely subjective. It therefore cannot be used as objective evidence for the lost continent of Mu. He simply reads into the text what he wants to. But this is a common strategy employed by fantastic history enthusiasts. The literal meaning of the writing is irrelevant. You have to read between the lines, man, and ascertain the secret meaning. And only those in the know can tell you what it means. And then they use this as evidence that their view of history is right. Think about the average person with just a limited amount of knowledge of history, what they learned in school. Reading a book like this. Churchward just goes from one piece of evidence to another, overwhelming his readers with so many apparent supports to his proposal. This is what we call a gish gallop. Someone who is not used to examining history critically might think to themselves, "Oh, he has so much here. It can't all be wrong. The list of proofs just goes on and on and on." But as you can see going through these, none of them hold up to scrutiny. The thing is, the average reader is not going to fact-check all these. That's a lot of work, and so they might be taken in by it. And that's why I went through the trouble of doing it. Hopefully people who were thinking there might be something to it now know that it isn't the case. I did receive a little help from a book called Lifting the Veil on the Lost Continent of Mu, Motherland of Man, by Jack Churchward, James Churchward's great-grandson. He spent a lot of time looking up his great-grandfather's sources, too. James Churchward does provide some archaeological evidence for Mu in his book as well, which consists mostly of looking for similarities in various cultures around the world. You've seen this kind of reasoning before as well, which I've discussed elsewhere. But time does not permit, and I will end up repeating myself. See my video about when fake archaeology uses fake science for more on that. Suffice it to say, for now, that the cultural and linguistic similarities observed among the peoples of Oceania, Asia, and the Americas are not proof of a common civilization originating from Mu. Instead, these similarities can be attributed to contacts, migrations, and mutual influences over the centuries. Since there is no historical, documentary evidence for the existence of Mu, and there's no geological, archaeological, or scientific evidence either, it's reasonable to conclude that there is no solid basis for believing in the existence of the lost continent. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If you like this channel and you want to help keep it alive, please consider becoming a channel patron at patreon.com/World of Antiquity. Or you can give a one-time donation with a super thanks, right here on YouTube.
You might like my little e-booklet, Why Ancient History Matters. It's designed to persuade people that the subject is important, even in the modern world. You might also wish to use it to help spread the word, so feel free to share it with someone you know. It's free for anyone who wants it. I've left a link in the description box below the video for you to grab a copy. Catch you later.